Previously on Gears.
So at present, we are in an adjournment in the Oscar Pistorius trial as he undergoes psychiatric evaluation as an outpatient. Now, it has been one of the most intriguing cases that we've had in South Africa, purely because we've been able to see and watch and listen, which has been first for us in South Africa, hasn't it?
It's been very interesting.
Exactly. Now, the thing about it is it's gripped most of the nation, and the times that we've sat on this show and on the other shows as well on Balls, where we've wanted to say something about it, means that you've got to try and get more and more involved in it to make sure that you don't sound like a complete plonker. So you've got to try and get as many facts as possible. Now, amazingly, I've been watching and following it quite intently. And there are a lot of times you go to just a normal news website or whatever, and they give you like a mishmash of nothingness, to be very, very honest. But then I managed to follow this lady on the Twitface and became like a stalker. I hope she's not listening. And I became like a stalker because I got really, really interested in her linguistic brilliance in the sense of writing. And I've found that this lady has got the most thorough observation in terms of what I can pick up in the Oscar Pistorius trial. She writes for the Daily Maverick, maybe she writes for other things, but we'll find out. And her name is Rebecca Davis. So, Rebecca, thank you, and thank you for joining us here on Balls Visual Radio.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm blushing.
Are you blushing? Oh, that's very sweet.
You've made his day. He's been very nervous about this interview.
You see, I have.
Likewise.
I have. But now, do you only write for the Daily Maverick?
I don't, Sasha. I do a bunch of other stuff. The most regular other fixture is that I write a weekly TV column for the Sunday Times, which is in the Sunday Times lifestyle section. But I'm also on radio a bit and sort of all over the show.
But I mean, you spend. Do you ever have like a social life? Because everything I see, you either writing about the Oscar trial, or you're writing about Parliament, or you're writing whatever it is. You're on top of it.
I am on top of it. I drink quite heavily whenever I can, though.
My kind of a guy. I knew we'd get on. I just knew. Rebecca, I know you're a very busy lady, so we really appreciate that you coming on the show. And there's certain things that I think that maybe our listeners want to know that we maybe don't see or hear all of the time. More of the behind the scenes, because for those who read your columns, I think they are so thorough that you basically get 100% of what's actually going on in the courtroom in terms of the facts that are presented.
Thanks. I hope so. I have to be honest, when it gets to some of the most technical testimony, particularly from ballistics and that sort of thing, I do find myself nodding off a bit. But let's hope the major facts are there.
All right. Now, Rebecca, you've been following this, I assume, from day one. What have you? I mean, I'm assuming you've been in courtrooms before, but have you ever? I mean, this is a sort of not a once-off, but a first for us here in South Africa. Has it made a massive difference to the way that people have sort of conducted themselves?
Yeah, it's interesting, Sasha. I was reading a piece in the Irish Independent last week, I think, where somebody had written an op-ed saying that the Pistorius trial was evidence that courts in Ireland should start televising procedures. So it's clearly having an impact internationally, which is interesting and sort of, I think, a bit of a big up to us, because our justice system is on display for the world to see, and people seem to be reasonably happy, even the Pistorius family on their version at the moment, that it's going okay. It's interesting to think about how different the kind of court performances would be if it wasn't being televised to the world. And I particularly wonder if some of the theatrics we see from Gerinal and Barry Rue would be toned down a bit. But I haven't actually followed any cases closely that the two of them have been involved in. I do understand that actually the way they're conducting this trial is pretty much par for the course when it comes to their normal courtroom antics.
Yeah, I must say, I've been very impressed with the two of them in the sense that they haven't really been affected by cameras on them, and they've just gone about their daily work, which I think is must be quite daunting for them, because they more than likely are not used to this kind of camera activity. But I'm sure post trial they might well become superstar TV pundits. I don't know.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, it looks like it's going that way anyway. You magazine, I think, has had a few sort of exclusives trying to dig into as much of their lives as they can. And obviously, the lawyers themselves aren't permitted to talk to the media at all during the trial. So I imagine when it's over, we're going to get a hell of a lot of stuff from them. But I do think that one of the things that has kept the media sort of under control a bit has been the very dignified presence of Judge Masipa, obviously.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, that she herself is a former journalist, she was a crime reporter for many years. So she actually understands the kind of pressures and strictures that journalists are working under, but certainly hasn't allowed that to dominate the court case. It can be quite intimidating sitting in that courtroom when someone's cell phone or something goes off, and, you do not want it to be you. You're praying for it to be anyone but you, when she makes you stand up, account for yourself, apologize, sends you out of court. It's like being in assembly all over again.
Well, I think that's also quite fascinating, because, there are protocols, there's a certain discipline that one has to adhere to in courts of law, and she's definitely upheld that. What are some of the things? Let me go to this one. What do you see that sometimes the public doesn't see? Because we don't get to see all of the witnesses, because they have the opportunity not to be shown. But is there anything that you've seen from perhaps a specific witness or various witnesses or orderlies that have really stuck in your mind?
Well, when we were still unsure of who the state witnesses were going to be, and latterly the defense witnesses, it was always interesting to see who was sort of buzzing around the courtroom in the mornings. Mm-hmm. Because the minute somebody who was on the state witness list came and sat there as an observer, you knew for sure they weren't going to be called, because you can't obviously sit and watch proceedings in court before you've actually testified. So that's why, for instance, the Myers family, Gina and Kim, who are Reeva's housemates, obviously, only started watching the trial from court very late in the day. And Gina, in fact, told me that she'd basically put her life on hold, for like a month or something, waiting to be called, didn't get the call, and then eventually was freed up. Also, it was interesting for us to see Mark Batchelor, the football player, obviously, who had some run-ins with Ozzy himself, suddenly start appearing in court. And I wonder, actually, if some of Batchelor's appearances haven't been sort of a psych-out attempt, because it was very interesting to note that he was in court the session after Pistorius was heard making that rather strange comment to Kim Myers about how she slept at night. Yeah. The next session, truth God, she was back with Mark Batchelor, who, as you know, is a pretty imposing physical presence by her side, possibly as a bit of a message. So I suppose the main thing you get from being in the courtroom is sort of, I wouldn't say it was even so much being able to witness Pistorius, because the live TV feed does sort of hone in on him a little bit. I think it's more interesting to look at the responses of the observers, and particularly the families, to see what points seem to be sort of interesting or freaking them out. Mm-hmm. It's been useful for me. I've been sort of ensconced behind the Steenkamp family, so that's been June Steenkamp and her cousin Kim Martin and so forth. And every now and then, for instance, during Oscar's testimony, he'd say something and they'd be shaking their heads, they'd be looking at each other. Yeah. For instance, when he said that he'd waited to open Reeva's Valentine's card until her birthday, and then he gave the date of her birthday. And I saw straight away they were looking at each other and going, ha! So the break came and I'm like, what's up with that? And of course he'd got her birthday wrong, which didn't look very good. But it's those kind of cues that you wouldn't necessarily pick up at home that you see from being in that environment. And of course, just watching Pistorius himself come and go every morning. He's actually very sort of polite and, I wouldn't say friendly, but polite and cordial to journalists. He's often nodding, sort of mouthing hello. So it's difficult to read too much into what he says. And I do think also that there's a danger in the kind of journalism that watches Pistorius obsessively, noting when he's crying and retching and and whatever else, because I think it can be quite offensive to the family of the deceased as well if you're seeming to put Oscar's emotions as so primary to this trial when they're like, we're the ones who have lost a daughter, a friend, a loved one. So I'm personally quite careful about not being seen to sort of obsess about Oscar's state too much.
Yeah, I sometimes, from other things that I've read around, I've sometimes found that there's been a very terrible slant in terms of subjectivity, and the focus is purely on Oscar, for example, being ill in the court, etc., and then there's no regard for Reva, the unfortunately deceased in the case. But I mean, that's just an observation where I suppose, as you've just mentioned, people could get a little bit caught up in it. Have you, Rebecca, when you observe Oscar, and I mean, we have had the opportunity, at least from the TV, to actually see most of the time, besides the times that he was ill and there was tremendous emotion shown by him, I must say I found him incredibly composed for somebody who must be under an incredible amount of stress.
That's right. And the funny thing is, Sasha, on the very first day of court, there's a bit of a character, one of the journalists. He's an elderly English guy who I think is reporting for Fox Radio. And in the very first day of the courtroom, he was delivering a package just after the day's proceedings had ended, right still in the middle of the courtroom. And he's got his radio voice on, and he's like, and the world-famous athlete appeared sort of strangely composed, no doubt as a result of all the heavy medication he's taking. And we were all looking at each other going, what, man, where is he sucking this nonsense from? Because at that stage, there was no evidence whatsoever that Pistorius was on any medications. We just thought it was evidence of a quite sensational slant from the international media. Then, of course, his testimony came, and it was shown that he was, in fact, on medication, quite heavy antidepressants and anti-anxiety stuff. So I do think, realistically, that probably is playing a part in his composure, because I agree with you, Sasha. And when he's not totally losing it, he actually has been fairly composed. And I have to say, he's probably also bored a lot of the time, even though his life is on the line, as he continuously likes to remind us. These proceedings are very lengthy, very tiring, very arduous. There was a day when he was reportedly seen copying down Bible verses, which I suppose is one way to pass the time. But some of the rest of the time when journalists are reporting or tweeting that he's got his head in his hands or staring at the floor, I think he's actually on his phone, to be perfectly honest. I think he's doing a bit of sneaky texting or WhatsApping. Obviously not during the court proceedings necessarily, but before, during breaks.
Yeah. Or maybe just putting his eyes, closing his eyes and pretending he's listening to all of these testimonies that come out as well. Rebecca, in terms of the responsibility, in terms of journalists when it comes to reporting, yes, we do have the opportunity where we do have the facts that are presented to us because we're allowed to watch it or listen to it. But there must be a lot of gossip that when you take a tea break or a lunch break and everyone's running around trying to get a report done or whatever. In terms of the gossip, I mean, have you picked up anything that has been like shockingly bizarre?
Look, the thing is that because, as I said, you can't speak officially to the lawyers involved in the case, there's actually very little opportunity to get kind of massive scoops at this stage, because also you absolutely cannot be seen to prejudice any evidence. So if anything hasn't come up that might still come up in one of the side's cases, you would be in a huge cut, pardon my French, if you suddenly start publishing on that. Yeah. So from that perspective, there's not a sort of cutthroat atmosphere where people are trying to get scoops, although that was very much the case up in the lead up to the trial, you might remember, where the tabloids were paying off anyone they could find for evidence of his new girlfriend and the rest of it. So when it comes to gossip, I mean, what we hear more from outside the courtroom is people's continuously bizarre theories about the Pistorius case. And goodness me, Sasha, I've heard some absolute pearlers, ranging from Reva sneaking out to go to another Valentine's dinner, and that's why she had food in her stomach, to constant allegations about weird, drug parties that Pistorius was having. I mean, people seem to be cooking up the most insane conspiracy theories about how the police cleaned everything up for Pistorius. I mean, it's strange stuff. But when it comes to the actual events in the courtroom, I mean, there's also quite a spirit of camaraderie among the journalists there. So if somebody hears something, for instance, that one of the relevant and pertinent observers has said to another, it's generally passed around quite quickly, also for confirmation, because you don't want to be the doers who's claiming they said something and it's totally wrong.
Rebecca, Oscar Pistorius is now under psychiatric evaluation. There was a huge amount of speculation once Gerrie Nel sort of decided to take the defense up on the fact that he was under medication and perhaps wasn't in the right state of mind after the psychiatrist said her bit. And a lot of people have said this is a fantastic sort of win for Gerrie Nel, but people have also said this is a fantastic win for Barry Roux. How do you, in your personal opinion, from what you've seen and what happened on those days when that testimony came out from the psychiatrist, how do you see it playing out in this very delicate game of chess?
It is a chess game, Sash, and I think it blindsided a lot of us. And I think it genuinely blindsided Barry Roux as well. So I think anyone who's claiming that it was always his hope, for instance, that Pistorius would be referred, I think is on the wrong track. And obviously we don't know for sure. Yeah. But he seemed to genuinely and very vehemently oppose the suggestion. We heard that Pistorius himself described it as a joke, so it obviously wasn't something he was relishing or taking seriously either. I think that the state has very little to lose out of it, actually, as far as I can see, because Forster herself said it was highly unlikely that at the end of it, Pistorius would be found to be not criminally responsible for his actions. Yeah. So as far as I'm concerned, I think we can pretty much rule that out as an outcome. So it seems that pretty much the worst that can happen from the state's perspective is that the team of psychiatrists and psychologists will confirm Forster's diagnosis that he has generalized anxiety disorder, in which case they're no worse off than they really were. The testimony now has a bit more heft behind it, but it was always going to be there from Forster. And of course, in the best case for the state, the psychiatrists come back and say, he doesn't have generalized anxiety disorder, or if he does, it's in such a weak form that it would have absolutely no impact on his actions on the night of the shooting. And in that case, they're great. Then they get to sort of discount Forster's testimony. They get to cast huge on Pistorius' version as well, if he isn't so anxious that he would have been led to behave in such a bizarre way. So I think actually Gerrie Nel's the winner here. I fail to see how actually this could be working out stupendously well for Barry Roux.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Finally, Rebecca, because I know I really have extended our time and I appreciate it. The court will resume on the 30th of June. How long? We don't know what will come out from the psychiatrists and psychologists' analysis, but all things being equal, how much longer do you think this trial will take place in terms of being in court?
Yeah, that's the million-rand question. Well, they'll come back with the report, right, and they'll submit it to the court, and they'll also submit it to Pistorius himself. And don't forget, that might actually make quite interesting reading for Pistorius, because on his own account, he didn't know he had this anxiety disorder. And some people I actually feel quite sorry for, Sasha, is his siblings who were sort of just thrown in the boat as well and forced to testifying. They've all got it. They've all got generalized anxiety disorder, and they're sitting in the courtroom going, we do. So we'll read the report, the court will consider it, but it won't necessarily delay proceedings as far as I understand. Then we've got 3 more witnesses, supposedly, for the defense, at least one of which will be yet another psychologist.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they'll break for closing arguments, which I understand could be even over a month, actually. So that could be a really significant break. They'll deliver closing arguments. Then there'll be another break, obviously, for Masipa and her assessors to chat about what's gone down. So, look, I think we're looking, into August, possibly September even. We're looking at a good chunk of this year being taken up by this almighty trial.
Unbelievable. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time, and I do hope that once the trial's over, we can have a chat again.
That would be lovely, Sash. I look forward to it.
Awesome, and carry on doing what you're doing. It's really fantastic.
GearsOnBalls.co.za with Sasha Martinenko and Daisy Fensham. Weekdays 1 p.m. to 3 p.m.